just can't get enough.
Across Australia, this is Money News with Brooke Corty.
Money.
Hello and welcome to the show. Investors were in quite a mood today, I gotta say. We had the S&P ASX 200 closing 0.2% higher at 7,503, but don't let the headline fool you. There were some very violent reactions, I'd say, as to some of the disappointments that came out of the company earnings season. I'll mention the financial results out today from Ansell, Kogan.com and Boral specifically. And in fact, I'll chat with the Boral CEO in just a moment. As I mentioned last night, shipping stuff into Australia just is not as easy as it used to be. And it is getting harder by the day as well. The network of ports and shipping containers that move stuff all around the world, they're in a tangled mess, and every single one of us is going to be impacted. Tonight, I know it's only August, but we do need to talk about your Christmas shopping with the Australian Retailers Association's Paul Zara, who will join me shortly. Also on tonight's show, we'll explain the recent collapse in the iron ore price. Have you noticed it? It happened very, very quickly, and there are some big economic ramifications we'll get across when we speak with InvestSmart's Evan Lucas. And I'll tell you how much you need to retire and why the figure has just gone up. 131873, that's my open line number. My text is 0460 873 873. You can email me anytime via the feedback icon on the website as well. All of that and plenty more ahead for you on Money News. The bitumen, cement and building products giant Boral reminded us today that past performance is no guarantee of future success. Boral today reported a huge turnaround in net profit. It swung from a $1.15 billion loss last year to a net profit of $639 million this year. That's a 156% turnaround from revenue of about $5.3 billion. It was an impressive set of numbers. But a murky outlook is what has spooked investors. Boral has detailed the financial toll of the lengthening lockdown restrictions on construction in multiple states. The dividend was scrapped and shares dived about 5.5% to close at $6.48. Zlatko Todachevsky is the CEO of Boral, and he joins me on Money News. Welcome, Zlatko.
Thanks very much, Brooke.
I want to start with that big turnaround in net profit. What went well for Boral last financial year?
Well, I think if you go back to FY20, Brooke, that was a really challenging year, and the negative statutory net profit we had really reflected the very, very large impairment we took predominantly in North America. So I'd say that was a bit of an anomaly. But this year, the statutory profit includes the profit that we made, particularly on the sale of our USG Boral joint venture. So when you normalise for those two, I think we're pleased with the progress we've seen in the business. We delivered substantial transformation benefits that boosted EBIT earnings in Australia, and we saw a strong turnaround, particularly in our North American building products business, that contributed to the total operational results in the year. So both of those jointly were quite strong relative to what we've seen previously.
That was then, and now we have pretty shaky ground, I guess we can all agree. You flagged a $50 million hit to profit in the current 3 months, so that's July, August, September. Just paint a picture for us of how lockdowns and construction go-slows are impacting Boral at the moment.
Yeah, it's been a really frustrating situation, frankly, Brooke, because if you think back to last year, through all of the lockdowns and issues around the pandemic, construction remained open. So I guess nobody in our sector or any of our customers foresaw that construction would be shut down in July of this year. So it came as a real surprise when New South Wales took that decision in mid-July. And frankly, we got no warning about that. So we had to then scramble to deal with which operations shut down. We had to stand down 630 people. And frankly, we couldn't give them any certainty on when operations would commence again. So it was quite a challenging environment for everybody. And then you've seen further restrictions happening in South Australia, construction shuts in ACT and restrictions happening in Victoria. It's just a really challenging environment. So what we're really looking for now is some clarity on how we can reopen construction, provide people with some confidence, and ideally we'd love to see a much more national approach for not only how lockdowns might occur in the future, but more importantly, the pathways to coming out of that to give everybody the clarity and confidence they need.
So you put a figure of $50 million on the hit from July to September, but this is the point. Lockdowns won't end in September, and they're going to be slower this year to be lifted than they were last year. So what do you picture October to Christmas looking like?
Look, if you go back to the period before the lockdown started to happen in July, Brooke, we were really positive. We had seen very, very strong volumes in May and June, and quite an anomaly compared to what we'd seen in the year prior. So we were feeling quite good about the underlying demand, and it was quite strong into the first couple of weeks of July. So the lockdowns couldn't have come at a worse time. Sitting here today, what we're looking for is clarity on the pathway to reopening not only the broader economy, but particularly construction. So what will it take to ensure that we don't have further lockdowns? What are the restrictions that are appropriate? And frankly, construction operated quite well last year. So sitting here today, I don't believe that construction shuts were required, but they've happened. So how do we get out of that and give everybody the certainty that we need? That's what we'd like to see through the balance of this calendar year.
You'd have to imagine a hit October to December as well, though, in addition to July to September, given what you've said, though. I mean, that's not going to come anytime soon, everything you've just wished for there.
Well, what we've seen, if you think about the different market experiences we've had, Brooke, so, Adelaide or South Australia more generally, there was a one-week construction shut, and 4 weeks later, we're seeing volumes ramp up, but not yet where they need to be. So it's easy to shut down construction. It takes a lot of time to ramp it back up when you've got to reorganise trades and materials and supply chains. So there is a lingering effect. We've got visibility to what we think will happen over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Beyond that, it's quite uncertain. But I think the underlying demand is good. We just need to get restrictions lifted so we can meet that demand.
You're the perfect person to chat to because you're a national company, you're supplying crucial materials for construction projects, anything from residential builds to major nation-building infrastructure projects. So you are literally active everywhere. So your read on this is certainly very timely and crucial for us, I think, to understand. More broadly, you're unwinding a big offshore expansion strategy pursued by your predecessor, Mike Kane. The US-based fly ash business, purchased for $3.5 billion 5 years ago, it doesn't sound like you're going to make your money back. Will you end up copping a loss on that one?
Well, just maybe to remind everybody, Brooke, we did take quite a large impairment in August of last year where we wrote down the value of our North American businesses in total. That includes both building products and fly ash. And yes, there was a $3.5 billion Australian acquisition done in Headwaters, but that included some building products. So we successfully sold that building products business a couple of months ago. We announced that we were going to get US $2.15 billion. The last remaining business in North America is fly ash. So we're at the final stages of that. We now have a short list of some very interested parties. Obviously, I can't talk about the value range that we're thinking about, but I'd love to come out of the North America experience, at least washing our face and not carrying a loss on those sales.
And, of course, the other big issue that's been, at the forefront for the last couple of months is billionaire Kerry Stokes' Seven Group staging a classic corporate raid, becoming now a new majority shareholder. So bringing up the stake from 20% in May to about 70% by the end of July. Ryan Stokes, your new chairman there at Boral. Kerry looms large in the picture. And I guess common sense says with names like Kerry and Ryan Stokes now very much in the picture, they've got some kind of strategy that they'd like to pursue. What kind of pressures are they putting on a change of direction or decisions being now made for the foreseeable future?
And I can't speak to, Brooke, what their strategy of Seven Group might be, but what I can say is in all the conversations I've had with Ryan, either before the takeover was launched or since he's rejoined the boardroom, we've had complete alignment. I think they understand and respect the strategy that we've outlined. He's been very supportive of the portfolio actions we've taken. The pace at which we're moving, everybody recognises is quite fast here. So I'd say there's absolutely no misalignment. And frankly, I haven't seen Seven Group pushing any kind of agenda onto the board in the conversations we've had since he's rejoined. I think it's a really constructive conversation, man.
Zlatko Todashevsky, thank you so much. CEO of Boral, appreciate your time on Money News.
Thanks very much, Brooke.
131873, if you want to chat with me on the program tonight. I mean, I think that is just such an admission, isn't it? That the impact on the construction industry of the confusion that's been delivered by the state and federal governments means even the biggest companies in construction say they don't have any visibility on the situation beyond the next 6 weeks. Yeah, sure, we have an evolving situation, we get that part, but what a failure of leadership. The confusion that has been created, the wasted effort, the tangled web of restrictions and miscommunications about how everyone's supposed to have been managing all of this. And what on earth happens beyond the next 6 weeks, we don't even know. So I wonder what your experience is, especially if you're in the construction space. 131873, or you can text me 0460 873 873. Maybe you also agree with the CEO of Boral there, that underlying demand is actually good. You've got a good pipeline. It's just getting through this next little while, however long that lasts. I'd love to hear from you tonight. 131873. Meantime, have you noticed more and more companies launching campaigns to, well, twist the arm of people to get vaccinated? A new campaign launched by the taxi company 13 Cabs that says passengers can request a vaccinated driver. Stuart Overall's the Chief Operating Officer at 13 Cabs, and he's spoken to our political reporter Lucy Gray today. And he said he suspects most people will prefer a fully vaccinated driver, saying those who haven't had a jab will likely deliver parcels rather than passengers. Do you support this new policy? If you're a cabbie, 131873, what do you think of it? I mean, the company's not mandating vaccines yet. Essentially, it's a matter of time, though, isn't it? Eventually, what you're hearing there, the message is unvaccinated drivers will be given other roles, contactless roles. You won't be doing what you have been doing. So if you're a cabbie, let me know what you think of that. I've got to say, Seek had similarly strong words today. The new boss at Seek is Ian Narev. You might remember him from CBA, of course. And he essentially says, if you're going to be out there job hunting, it is, and this is the quote, inevitable and imminent that businesses will demand to know if an applicant for the job they post is vaccinated. So if you're out there hunting for a job, do not expect to make the short list if you're holding out getting a vaccination. That was his message. Of course, as you know, SPC and Qantas, they've become the first two large companies to make vaccines compulsory for all staff. There's a very complicated debate that's playing out in HR law just as much as personal ethics. I mentioned last night the wharfies at Port Botany, one of the largest container ports in the southern hemisphere. They've been told, and mate, you might be one of them, you can't work on the site from Monday if you hadn't had at least one jab. Now, do you reckon that's a carrot or a stick? Maybe it depends on the timelines. I will say there was one other major CEO who came out against mandatory vaccinations today, and that was the boss of the protective equipment maker Ansell. He said forcing people to do things is just a step too far. Magnus Nicolin says, yes, he supports incentives to get vaccination rates up, but making the jab mandatory is, I quote, skating on thin ice. What about you? Have you been told by your employer you're going to have to get the jab or stand aside for others who have? But especially if you're not vaccinated and don't plan to be, don't you think it will affect your employment? Will it affect your ability to travel? How do you think it plays out for you? Are you going to be able to do what you used to do? Maybe that's a trade-off you're comfortable with, but particularly, I do want to know, do you think it will affect your employment? 131873 if you want to give me a call on that. I am chatting this week with Screw Turner from Flight Centre, and you can probably guess, squarely alongside Qantas as one of the companies that has lost probably the most because of COVID. He's got no problem with mandatory jabs, so that conversation rolls on. We'll take a quick break. Why iron ore has plunged recently the last 3 months. We'll get to grips with that one after this break. Welcome back to Money News. 131873. We'll try and take some calls coming up. But you know what else caught my eye today? The Prime Minister keeping up the pressure on the state and territory leaders to stick to the national reopening plan. And particularly, he says he expects interstate travel to be back up and running in time for Christmas. Geez, that's not what I had in my head. So that is a good sign. As I said, I am chatting with the Flight Centre boss, Graham Screw-Turner, Thursday, so I'll put that to him. Meantime, the fact that we cannot fly around our own country freely is, I mean, it's frustrating to say the least. But it's interesting how costly that has been now for a lot of companies. The one that called that out today was the engineering group Monadelphous. And it particularly called out WA's border decisions as being so unpredictable. Workers have been so worried about getting stuck in the state, they're now having to increase wages by up to 10% just to hire and keep people. People are so worried about going in and out of, across state borders, as they should be. I mean, gosh, good on them if they even want to take a 10% increase and risk all that. The problem for Monadelphous in particular, and the shares dropped 14% on this today, the problem for Monadelphous in particular is up to half of their construction workers in the Pilbara come from outside WA. So the fact that we can't fly so freely it's got wage issues, it's got skilled shortage issues in various trades, and essentially the fact that they struck contracts at fixed prices before COVID, it's getting harder to make money out of those contracts. And again, if you're in this space, if you're in construction, you've had fixed price contracts, maybe you know exactly what they're talking about. Does this resonate with what's happening to your company? Maybe you're having to pay over the odds for workers, maybe not even the best workers, just a warm body to fill the void. Let me know how you're going. 0460 873 873 if you want to text me.
And now on Money News, the Market Wrap. Thanks to Bell Direct, proud supporter of Money News, a simply better approach to online investing.
And I'll try and whip through this and maybe come back to some of these big stories a bit later. I want to get to my next guest, but huge share price moves today, even though the ASX 200 only closed 0.2% higher at 7,503. We have to mention Nanosonics. So this is a company that provides disinfection products for ultrasound machines, jumping 22%, a very upbeat outlook there. Seek returned to profits. It did offer outlook guidance, unlike others today, but the shares were 0.7% weaker at $31.30. Ansell shares, I will get back to that one. That was down 9% to $36.78. A savaging after its results and outlook. And the other one was Austal, the shipbuilder. The stock down 13% to $2.18. Reported a drop in revenue, a slide in earnings, but yeah, a couple of analysts at Citi said they just didn't even understand that reaction. I mean, it was wild out there today. But I guess what it does say to us, if we go through all the various results, and Kogan is another one I will mention coming up, is that things change so quickly at the moment, don't they? And in that basket, we can put iron ore. Iron ore has been absolutely in free fall. When prices were back at, back in May, about $230 a ton, we knew that couldn't last forever. We knew China was probably going to hit a softer patch and that would come off a bit. But the speed of the unwind that we've seen in the iron ore price, no one expected. The iron ore price is down 40% in the last 3 and a bit months, traded today around $136 a ton. Evan Lucas is head of strategy at InvestSmart. He's on the line with us. Evan, welcome to the show.
Hello, Brooke. How are you?
Well, yeah, good. What's happened then? How would you explain such a quick turnaround for the iron ore price?
Savaging. It's interesting. It comes down to China, and this has to be part of the discussion. There's also simple economics, and I'll start with that point first. We do have a supply and demand change. Supply looks like going over and above what was forecasted by about 60 million tonnes out of Australia. And it could even be more than about 40 million tonnes out of Brazil. Already this year has seen a record amount of shipment to China, and there's expected that they have about 260 million tonnes of iron ore that they've actually stockpiled, plus those additionals I talked about. So that's the supply. Then the other side of it is demand, and this is where the China story comes into it. The Chinese demand story is again down to the movements around what the government wants to happen. They have made a regulatory move around cutting steel production basically to 2019-2018 levels, which means after what was a record output in the first half of the calendar year, they have to basically almost stop to a grinding halt to reach those figures. So therefore, demand for iron ore for the steel-making product is falling like a stone. So those two parts are the two to highlight first and foremost. The other one that also will be very interesting going forward is the regulatory environment around the output requirements around Hebei province and also the Beijing Olympics. Why I highlight the Beijing Olympics, just like in 2008, next year, 2022 with the Winter Olympics, environmental cleanliness is going to be a big, big part of what they want, which means the amount of pollution in the air around China needs to drop to make sure that they don't have smog or some form of acid rain issues. And therefore, steel is actually expected to be in a really subdued period all the way through to June next year after the Winter Olympics.
And so all of that's going on. I'm trying to get a consensus when I look at analysts about how far they think it could fall. I mean, it could be quite a bit lower from here. Just quite quickly, have you got a gauge on, prices that we should be looking at?
So I think the way I'd probably say it to you is you have to probably expect it to revert back to the sort of 5-year average, which is more around sort of $70 to $90 a ton. So it's still a fall. The speed of it, no idea. And I deliberately say that because the speed of which we've come back in the last 3 months, as you highlighted, it is actually $100 a ton loss is something we haven't really seen of that kind of speed in iron ore. And also we hadn't ever really seen China slow themselves down as much as they have in the last sort of 3 months. So how fast it gets back to that average is an unknown. But the expectation around analysts and most pundits is that they believe it'll go back to the 5-year average, which, as I said, is between 70 and 90 US a ton, which is still, we're talking about $40 from where we're currently at to the top of that range. Yeah. And it's $60 to the bottom. So there's still a little way to play out.
Which, the collapse in the price of our biggest export now we can see is happening at exactly the wrong time for the economy, given the impact of lockdowns that we're hearing detailed by corporate Australia, and people are feeling on the ground. They don't need other people to tell them how painful the current period is. So what would you say the economic ramifications of the fall now for the iron ore price at this time?
So this is the perfect question because we know that the third quarter of this calendar year will be a contraction. Consumption is down, private investment down because of lockdowns. The question always was how much we're going to bounce out of it in fourth quarter, and that is unknown. Hopefully, with what was announced, or at least sort of foreshadowed by Gladys Berejiklian today with regards to New South Wales possibly getting out in late September, early October, that it could therefore help. Maybe Dan Andrews is going to follow suit in Victoria. So there is a chance consumption could pick up. But part of the reason we've done so incredibly well is net exports. The value that we've extracted from iron ore has been incredible. In fact, at the start of the year, the first quarter was actually a record in terms of value because of that 230 US. The only thing we haven't spoken about here that's offsetting that is the fall in the Aussie dollar. The Aussie dollar is sitting at about 72. It has been as low as 71. There is expectations it could actually get into the 60 handle, like 68 or 69 cents towards the back end of the year. So it can offset the fall because obviously this is all priced in US dollars, but you can't go over 40% fall in price, even with that tailwind from the Aussie dollar, and not feel it. And therefore net exports, which has been a major positive for gross domestic product, could come back to being neutral, or it might find itself being overrun by imports, which are definitely starting to pick up. And therefore, net exports could actually be a negative number because imports are overdoing exports.
Okay, I'm going to be really mean to you now, Evan, in 30 seconds or less. For people who have watched the massive dividends from, the likes of BHP, Rio, Fortescue, love them, watch the big profits, and have just listened to all that, is it time they now review their iron ore investments, maybe think about cutting their exposure?
Okay, very quickly. First and foremost, the iron ore price fluctuations up and down don't always translate. In fact, they don't translate into the share price. So a 40% upside has not seen a 40% upside in Rio, BHP and Fortescue. It's the same on the downside. They do experience it. So I'll put that out there. It's been 15.5% drop in BHP since they talked about the demerger, not just obviously the results. And they're still going to pay a pretty chunky div. So some people are weighing that up. Do I think the $50 boom time in BHP is gone? Probably not, just because of the iron price. The structural changes that are happening in that company need to really play out. The removal of the petroleum business, the possibility that the S&P is going to downgrade them, all of them puts BHP in a different kettle of fish. Whereas if you look at Rio, I think Rio is going to tell you over time that it can weather much lower prices. I mean, it's designed to actually be running at about $10, $15 a ton in cost. So it's currently extracting premiums above what they normally operate as. So even in the $70 to $90 a tonne, Rio Tinto makes an incredible amount of money. It's just a question of whether or not the premium we're in will be maintained or reached again.
Head of Strategy at InvestSmart, Evan Lucas, thank you as always for your time on Money News.
Thank you, Brooke. We're
going to take some calls on 131873 from James and Audrey coming up after this break, talking about mandatory vaccinations with employers. Let's get some news headlines. We're late, Sophie Clark, but thank you. Good evening.
Good evening to you, Brooke. Making news, Australia Post is warning of minimal impacts to deliveries due to the temporary closure of Sydney's International Gateway facility after a cleaner contracted COVID-19 there. New South Wales Health is investigating the death of a Sydney woman in her 30s who had COVID and was found unresponsive in her home. Richard Pusey, the man who filmed 4 dying police officers after a crash on Melbourne's Eastern Freeway, has been banned from working as a mortgage broker for a decade after making false statements to authorities. And a blockbuster live-action adventure series heading to the Gold Coast is tipped to inject close to $100 million into the Queensland economy. In sport, Denny DeToro and Riley Batt will lead the Australian team into the main stadium tonight for the opening ceremony of the Tokyo Paralympics. There'll be more news in about 25 minutes.
Welcome back. Taking your calls this evening, 131873. We've been talking about companies mandating vaccines. James is on the open line this evening. James, so what's your view on all that?
Hi there. I'm first of all, I'm strongly for vaccination in general, but I do believe that one of the fundamental freedoms is deciding what you choose to put into your body. So I'm strongly against it from a principle of that kind of liberty. But what the key thing about this vaccination is that we know it's highly effective at preventing hospitalisation and deaths from the vulnerable. But what isn't being discussed and what is common knowledge amongst the medical profession is that this vaccine is doing almost nothing to stop and prevent transmission. So if someone is unvaccinated in a workforce, they are not endangering the rest of the workforce by being vaccinated at all. And that is basic common fact in the medical profession at the moment. And that needs to be discussed and weighed up into this entire argument.
Yeah, thanks for your call, James. I appreciate that. Of course, we know, companies are being left to deal with the legal side of all of this because governments are not creating very clear rules. And, yeah, I think there's a long way for this discussion to go, of course, yeah. I do want to take more calls on that, but I also want to mention shipping because shipping stuff into Australia is not as easy as it used to be. Global supply chains are so disrupted and so congested right now. Experts are saying it's going to be years before we can go back to looking anything like the old normal when it comes to shipping. It's the reason I mentioned last night we're being warned to think about Christmas shopping now. And even then, some things may not arrive on time. We have a perfect storm of global freight chaos. Shipping containers are in Europe and they should be in China. The frantic Chinese ports keep getting hit by COVID outbreaks. There's queues of ships 50 deep. This is the tip of the iceberg and it is getting worse by the week. They say the cost of moving shipping containers out around the world is about 11 times more expensive than pre-pandemic. And it's increasing by as much as 14% every week. So Aussie retailers are flagging now in August. Major delays are likely to hurt us in December. Can Santa save us? I'm not so sure. Paul Zara is the CEO of the Australian Retailers Association. Paul Zara, you've been hanging on the line for us. Thanks so much for your time tonight.
Good evening, Brooke.
So how great is the worry about Christmas gifts and, supply of everything we want and need at Christmas in August?
Well, yeah, look, it's got to be a record, I reckon, because it's almost like 4 months to the day that 4 months out from Christmas, and we're already talking about Christmas. But these are the facts. COVID has disrupted many things, all of our lives, but including supply chains. And what we're seeing is global supply chains have been deeply affected by COVID, and anything from the reduction in flying incoming flights into the country, where it's put pressure on shipping. So, of course, retailers have had to get product shipped into the country. That takes much longer lead times, much longer planning times as well. And, of course, you've got the situation in China where they've had a partial closure of a major container port because they had a case of COVID. So it does mean that retailers have had to plan a lot better this year, and it means that, yes, people need to start thinking about Christmas a little bit earlier.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think we as a population have a full appreciation for just how bad the situation is because, for me, it's kind of like plumbing. It happens and you just assume it all works and everything does its thing until something goes wrong. And then you go, hang on, how's this plumbing work? It's kind of the same with shopping, right? The shipping that allows us to buy the stuff and be so convenient to us, click of a button on the computer and there it is. I mean, this is the stuff we don't see, but it's complete chaos right now.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of, obviously, many people that are involved in getting a good from the manufacturer to the retail store, and it comes obviously, particularly if it's an international route, it can take many weeks and sometimes months to get here. But of course, this has forced retailers to plan way further in advance than they would normally have to plan. And what we do know is that most of the major retailers have planned their inventory. They've got a higher level of inventory than they would normally have this time of the year, but it does not mean that you may, if you're shopping for Christmas products, that you'll get the brand that you particularly were looking for. You might have to switch brands to get the item that you're after, because purely we just can't guarantee the supply chain right now.
Right. So ranges could be limited, and I imagine stuff could be more expensive, of course.
Well, this is it. So it is also putting a huge cost impost onto retailers, and a lot of the ASX companies have come out with some significant commentary around costs. But a container, for example, is up to 4 times pre-pandemic cost level. So ultimately, most retailers are trying to absorb that cost right now, but at some point that cost will be passed on to consumers, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting because, Anthony Heritage, the Super Retail Group boss, he was one of them. So this is the group with Super Cheap Auto, boating, camping, fishing. He said if orders for stock aren't made 8 to 12 months in advance, there's little to no chance of it arriving in time. The interesting thing about, what you've said there too is the retailers, and, this includes small retailers, trying to bulk up their inventory and hold a lot of stock when we have this very unsure outlook when it comes to demand. We don't know how much we'll be shopping by Christmas. Will we all be still in lockdown and thinking, well, this is all pretty dreary, I don't want to spend any money? This is actually, it's a pretty tentative scenario.
Well, this is why I think the key message here is for consumers not to leave their Christmas shopping to the last minute. If you're purchasing items online, give plenty of time for your product to be shipped and delivered to avoid disappointment. And of course, too, Brooke, I think most of the bigger cities are actually still in lockdown. I think once those lockdowns get lifted, it doesn't guarantee that the domestic borders won't stay down. So even just ordering online within the country will be delayed and will take time. So it does mean that we just all have to plan a little bit better than we have in the past.
Yeah, and of course the irony here, Paul Zara, is that we're talking about, shopping ahead early for Christmas, and I've just realised it's Father's Day and I still haven't bought something for Father's Day. So get out there and get your orders in for that too if you're like me. And I'm going to have to plan ahead this year, that's for sure. Thank you so much, Paul Zara from the Australian Retailers Association.
Pleasure.
So, bear with us for talking about Christmas in August, but I reckon you will thank us later, and you'll certainly thank Paul Zara for explaining all of that to you. I will also detail how Kogan.com is affected by all of that, because if you follow share markets, you'll have noticed Kogan shares down some 15% today, even more at points. So that was part of the story there. I'll detail it after the break, and plenty more other money news to catch up on next. I've got 2 examples of companies who are COVID winners who are now hitting trouble. First one, and there's a lot of detail here, and I'm going to take you through it. The first one is Kogan.com. I want to take you through the detail because it's one of those controversial companies. It was absolutely one of the biggest COVID winners last year as a pure online play. But the shares were down some 15% today because 18 months into this pandemic, there's a very different picture emerging for this COVID winner. We've just talked about massive shipping delays and inventory management with Paul Zara there, and this is a perfect example of the type of stuff that's going on. Kogan has had to contend with major inventory problems. Warehouses packed to the rafters, cheap TVs, cordless vacuum cleaners, products it's now finding tough to sell. And of course, as you can probably appreciate, with all the online shopping and the burst of e-commerce that we've now had, warehousing stuff is not cheap right now. And Kogan actually went to great extents to get more space, expanding its warehouse network from 14 to 31 facilities. Much of that has happened this year. So it took a big punt that it could carry last year's sales volumes into this year. And then, of course, the momentum disappeared. And really, it's only returned in the last, 6 weeks or so when half the country's plunged back into lockdown. So the questions are there, can Kogan keep kicking goals once we do hit this magic 80% vax rate and life is going back to normal? I wanted to ask Russ and Kogan about this, and we had an interview for tonight's show. Unfortunately, Russ and Kogan cancelled that interview at the 11th hour with very little notice. And perhaps that was because of the 15% plunge in the share price today. Also, of course, they do have a lot of earnings season calls, but that was pulled at the 11th hour. That major issue of shipping delays, that's a massive, massive problem for a company like Kogan, which brings all that stuff in from overseas. The other COVID winner, as I said, that's hitting trouble is Ansell. And look, if you wanted to be one company in a pandemic, surely it would be the company that makes protective equipment, because that has been in hot demand, and it meant a 48% jump in net profits to $265 million. Sales have been booming the last 18 months, but unfortunately that profit was not as big as the market expected today. And again, the outlook is shifting. We're talking about normalising life again, getting back to 80%, getting to 80% vaccination, and what that would mean. As you can imagine, as the impacts of COVID lessen, demand for PPE also eases. So they've got that, but also, along with all the other warnings we'd have from so many different companies in different sectors, it's warned about higher costs. It's had disruptions to its factories and disruptions to suppliers. So again, there's that cost issue. And who's going to wear the cost issue? Us as consumers. You get the pattern, don't you? This is coming up again and again, day in, day out. So it is going to be a feature of the next 6 to 12 months in particular. We as consumers are going to be wearing a lot of the extra costs that these companies are talking about right now in August. Ansell shares plunged 9% to $36.78. And in one other bit of financial news, personal, I'll add this in tonight. Just before my 6-year-old went to bed tonight, he had some bad news for me. I said to my little Charlie, "How's the day? Did you have a good day?" He said, "Yep, great day, except for the work." Homeschooling, of course, around here has been, up and down. And Charlie said to me, "I think what we're going to need to do is you'll have to pay me $1 for every minute of schoolwork that I do." I said to him, "Mate, that is going to be expensive." And when I thought about it, I reckon we're only averaging half an hour to an hour a day lately in lockdown. So good news is I reckon I'm in for a maximum $60 a day. Bad news is my son has realised time is money, and he's going to be charging me for it. I'll take a quick break. After this, I'll wrap things up. There are a couple of other stories to get across before Money News finishes. Stick around. Thanks for your texts and calls tonight. Sorry I couldn't get to some of those calls on mandatory vaccines. We're trying to squeeze a lot into tonight's show. I'll just let you know what's happening on global markets too, because it has been pretty up and down over the last few weeks. We're looking at European markets flat to slightly weaker. Pfizer vaccine approval news over there helping things. I'm looking at the FTSE index down 0.3% as one bit of news. I'm also seeing Airbnb as a big global company saying it plans to temporarily house 20,000 Afghan refugees housed in properties listed on Airbnb's platform. The stays will be funded by Airbnb. Now, they haven't said how much they're going to spend on that or how long they'll be housed for. But they have said 20,000 Afghan refugees. So that's a story that will play out this evening. That's just come through as well. And just finally on lockdowns being tied, the end of lockdowns being tied to vaccines, I guess we can put it like that. I did see this bit of news today as well. Only 11 countries have a AAA rating. We are one of them for now, but Standard & Poor's has said high vaccination rates followed by learning to live with the virus rather than lurching from lockdown to lockdown was an assumption underpinning our top rating. So if we veer away from that, and this is a message to those states, you know what I'm talking about, if we veer away from that, that plan threatens our AAA rating. So that is a big warning from the credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, as we debate that 80% level and what happens next. I will catch you tomorrow.